Okay. Our next speaker is Alan Goodman. He's a writer for Revolution newspaper, which you can get in the lobby at the Revolution bookstore table. Alan's it's no longer his most recent article, but he wrote one last week called Invoking the Holocaust to Silence Criticism of Israeli Crimes. Never Again. Alan Goodman.
A couple of weeks ago, I toured the Holocaust Museum in Manhattan. One of the displays that jolted me was the exhibit on the Warsaw Ghetto. In Warsaw, Poland in 1940, over 400,000 Jews, nearly 40% of the population of the city, were literally walled off in an area that comprised less than 5% of Warsaw. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto were systematically starved. They received only about a quarter of the amount of food the Polish population got, and less than a tenth the food rations provided for Germans. They had to smuggle in food and fuel and smuggle out products from their illegal workshops to survive. Within the ghetto, they organized cultural activities, schools, and social services, most of which were linked to organizations banned by the Nazis. By late 1942, hundreds of thousands of Jews had died of starvation in the Warsaw Ghetto or been sent off to Nazi death camps. When Jews rebelled in the famous Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they were brutally slaughtered and accused of starting the violence. As a matter of fact, they did start that uprising. But who today would say that the Nazis were justified in suppressing it? The parallels between the Warsaw Ghetto then and Gaza now are stark and sobering. 1.5 million people are crammed into the walled-off, impoverished, tiny strip that is Gaza. In addition to what other speakers have described, when Gaza ended the occupation and direct military rule of Gaza in 2005, it kept complete control of the land, sea, and air borders. Israel sent armored bulldozers to destroy Gaza's fruit orchards, blockaded the fishing port, cut off supplies to factories and other businesses. Most Gaza residents have been denied the right to work elsewhere or even leave. At the time of the current Israeli invasion, 1 million people in Gaza were dependent on UN food distribution, along with food and supplies smuggled in through tunnels from Egypt. A partially leaked but still secret report from the International Red Cross reported in 2007 that a dramatic fall in living standards has triggered a shift in diet that will damage the long-term health of those living in Gaza. This leads me to the theme I want to focus on tonight. Last Sunday, myself and someone else stood outside the Holocaust Museum in Manhattan with a banner that read, "After the Holocaust, the worst thing that has happened to Jewish people is the state of Israel." As some of you know, we were issued citations by the New York City Parks Police for, and I quote, displaying a banner criticizing Israel. And for over 2 hours, we were surrounded by as many as 28 NYPD and Parks Department squad cars with their lights flashing. The message on that banner was a quote from Bob Avakian, the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. It is counterintuitive, to say the least. The state of Israel has clearly been the worst thing that has happened to the Palestinian people. But this quote is saying that after the Holocaust, the state of Israel is the worst thing that has happened to Jewish people. To help get at this, let me share an experience I had in Hebrew school. This is something I've written about in Revolution. This took place in the mid-1960s when there was protest and rebellion in the air. This was also a time when the connection between the United States and Israel was emerging as the strategic relationship that it is today. And that was all reflected in things going on at the time in my Hebrew school. We had a teacher who was very popular, who was overall an enlightened guy who supported the civil rights movement, as many Jewish people did at the time. And one day the issue of Israel's alliance with South Africa came up. To me, at the time, Israel's support for South Africa seemed to be a gross betrayal of the ideals I had been taught Israel stood for, that it was an outpost of freedom and a symbol of the struggle against discrimination, not just for Jews, but as an example to the world. We continued to discuss and debate Israel's support for South Africa for a couple weeks, until at one point the teacher's demeanor changed and he spoke to us in a very serious tone of someone letting young people in on a fact of life. And what he explained was that the South African regime was not only racist, but that the South African rulers were ideologically close to and had been politically aligned with the Nazis in World War II. He further explained that South Africa had a whole structured caste system where not only were black African people denied all rights, but that mixed race people, Indians and others, were classified as colored and occupied lower positions in society than whites, sort of in between blacks and whites. And our teacher explained that if Israel didn't maintain its relationship with the apartheid regime, then the South African government would likely reclassify Jews from white to the colored category. I was really stunned and taken aback by this explanation, and I remember blurting out something along the lines of, "Why would we want to be white?" This was a heavy moment. This was a very heavy moment for me personally, and it had something to do with where I ended up politically. But more to the point, there was something about this experience that is very revealing about the role and nature of Israel and the kind of moral trade-off involved in the alignment of Jewish people with the state of Israel. Jews were viciously persecuted in Europe even before the Nazis. Jews, especially in Eastern Europe and pre-revolutionary Russia, were targets of violent pogroms. This situation changed after the socialist revolution in the Soviet Union, but the conditions for Jews in pre-revolutionary Russia and in Eastern Europe was not dissimilar from the kind of terror that black people faced in the rural post-slavery South. But among Jews in Europe and around the world, there were essentially two trends with two different views on how to respond to anti-Semitism. Many Jews were aligned with radical socialist, anarchist, or communist movements and saw their oppression in light of and as a component of the struggle against all oppression and exploitation. At the same time, the other main trend among Jews viewed the solution to the oppression of Jewish people in establishing a Jewish state in what was, after World War I, British-occupied Palestine. Explicit in the Zionist outlook and agenda was that this Jewish state would serve the interests of the colonial powers. Zionist leader Theodor Herzl put it this way: England, with her possessions in Asia, should be most interested in Zionism. I believe in England that the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should be easily understood. After World War II, the British sponsored the Zionist project on a large scale and enabled Jewish immigration to Palestine while turning their backs on massacres carried out by Zionist gangs like the Irgun to establish Israel on the basis of ethnic cleansing. Others have spoken to this, and it's documented in the packet of reprints from Revolution available here tonight. By the late 1960s, the United States replaced Britain as the main financial, political, and military sponsor of Israel. What did that relationship bring to the world? Throughout the Cold War, Israel was a bulwark in America's contention with the Soviet Union in the Middle East. During that period, Israel provided large-scale strategic military assistance to U.S. allies, not just in the region, but also to the Shah of Iran, to the death squads of the Christian fundamentalist regime of Rios Mott that systematically killed off entire villages of indigenous peasants in Guatemala. And Israel provided assistance to the Nicaraguan Contras, who carried out attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure to overthrow the elected government of Nicaragua. The establishment of Israel has been a disaster for the Palestinian people, and beyond that, a key prop in a world of pain and poverty that we live in today. But it also came at a terrible moral cost for the Jewish people who, forgive the biblical reference, accepted a mess of pottage in exchange for their souls and consciences. And as part of what we are doing, we need to put that challenge to people very sharply in the spirit of the quote that I read from Avakian. Let's tell it like it is. Jewish people were enlisted to set up an illegitimate settler outpost in the service of imperialism, and their persecution in Europe was used without any moral or logical justification to legitimize that. Finally, I want to very briefly identify and speak to one other factor that keeps people from protesting the current massacre in Gaza with the kind of passion and commitment that is demanded. People raise that Hamas and Islamic fundamentalism more generally are not an enlightened progressive force, and that the conflict with Hamas involves an aspect of a proxy war with Iran, which itself is a reactionary Islamic theocracy. This is true and it's explored in articles in Revolution newspaper, but two things must be said here. First, between these two reactionary forces, it is the United States that has brought far, far more suffering to the people of the world. And second, these Islamic fundamentalist forces would be largely dormant if it were not for the so-called war on terror, which is in reality aimed at tearing up the fabric of the Middle East and radically restructuring it in the interests of U.S. empire. But if you do not want to see the choices of the people of the world confined to picking between U.S. imperialism on the one hand or Islamic fundamentalism on the other hand, then you have to, right here and now in the United States, oppose your own side of this deadly equation. The more we do so, the more the people of the world see that there are people in this country who are not going along with the crimes of our government as it sponsors Israel's massacre in Gaza, the more basis there is for the people of the world to see the potential for another way, a really liberating, radical, revolutionary way to get beyond a world divided into oppressed and oppressors and all that goes with that. There's a challenge to everyone in this country to be part of the struggle to bring forward another way, a force in the world, including in this country, that does not look at the world from the perspective of Americans, but instead starts from and struggles for the interests of humanity. Enough already. Enough already with the outlook of me and my people first above everyone else, especially when that outlook is being invoked to align people with terrible crimes. Right now, right here, what is required from all of us is passionate and committed struggle against Israel's massacre in Gaza and condemnation of the U.S. role in these war crimes. And there is a challenge to not just act, but to follow the logic of your convictions, to struggle to understand the root causes behind Israel's massacre in Gaza and the U.S. role in this. And there is a challenge to learn more, to go where that takes you, including grappling seriously with what it is really going to take to bring about a whole better world.